The millionaire widower wanted a new mother for his son, a woman who could bring joy back to that silent mansion. He introduced the boy to 5 beautiful women, all rich, elegant, and eager to take on the role. But the boy's heart, wounded by the loss of his mother, had already chosen the only person who showed him true affection. So, at the moment of the big choice, in front of all the candidates, the boy ignored the women in expensive dresses, ran across the room, and threw himself into the arms of the simple cleaning lady. The scene left everyone, especially the father, in complete shock. The empire Arthur Blackwood built was a monument to his solitude. From his office on the mansion's top floor, with glass walls that framed the city skyline like a distant jewel, he watched the world through high-definition monitors. There were dozens of screens displaying stock market charts, cryptocurrency prices, and the constant flow of his multi-million-dollar businesses. His net worth grew with every second, a river of dollars and euros flooding into his account, inflating a capital he no longer knew how to spend. However, one small screen in the corner, connected to the internal security system, was the one he most dreaded looking at. On it, his 7-year-old son, Leo, was sitting alone in the immense garden, drawing figures in the dirt with a stick. Since the departure of his beloved wife, Isabella, 2 years ago, the mansion had become a silent palace, and Leo, a sad little prince confined within its gilded walls. Arthur, a practical man accustomed to solving problems with his checkbook, had already exhausted the obvious options. He had bought toys that overflowed an entire room, hired the best tutors, and planned exotic trips that were cancelled due to the boy's apathy. Nothing worked. Leo's sadness was the one liability on his balance sheet that money couldn't erase. That morning, while analyzing the profitability of a new investment fund, an idea struck him with the force of a business epiphany. Leo didn't need more assets. He needed a pillar, not a nanny, but a maternal presence. He needed a new mother. And as with all his business dealings, he initiated a meticulous selection process. His personal assistant, accustomed to finding targets for corporate acquisitions, received the strangest assignment of her career: to compile a list of eligible candidates. The criteria were as clear as those for a successful merger: women from reputable families, with a good education, unquestionable beauty, and preferably their own net worth that demonstrated stability. Within a week, the list was on his desk. 5 women, all perfect on paper. They were what the world would consider a perfect match, a sound investment for the future of his legacy, and, he hoped, for his son's heart. The plan was set. He would introduce them to Leo, one by one, over formal lunches and carefully planned outings. He would observe the interaction, analyze the data, and make a logical decision. Love, for Arthur, was just another variable to be controlled. While the first candidate was expected for lunch the next day, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a woman with protocols as rigid as her tight bun, entered the office. "Mr. Blackwood, the new cleaner hired by the agency, has arrived. Her name is Helena. Shall I instruct her to stay away from the private wings during the visits you'll be receiving this week?" she asked, her tone making it clear she already considered the new employee a nuisance. Arthur barely looked up from his papers. "Do as you see fit, Mrs. Davison. Just ensure everything is impeccable." To him, hiring a cleaner was an insignificant operational detail, a footnote in the grand project he was about to execute. Little did he know that in the silent corridors of his own home, a force far more powerful than his immense fortune had already been set in motion. On the monitor, Leo continued to draw in the dirt, oblivious to the plans that would shape his future. Suddenly, the boy stopped and looked toward the house, as if sensing a subtle shift in the air, a new and unfamiliar breeze beginning to blow through his kingdom of silence. The first candidate, Victoria Lancaster, arrived punctually at 11. She was the embodiment of calculated perfection, a woman whose family had built a real estate fortune and who moved with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. Victoria saw the meeting not as a lunch, but as the final stage of a high-level negotiation. Marriage to Arthur Blackwood would be an excellent investment, a merger of two great fortunes that would solidify both their statuses at the top of society. She presented Arthur with a gift, a rare bottle of wine whose value exceeded the annual salary of many, and chatted with him about the stock market and the latest trends in contemporary art. Arthur assessed her with his analytical gaze. She was intelligent, ambitious, and socially impeccable. On paper, she was perfect. Then Leo was called. The boy entered the living room, his small shoulders hunched under the weight of his silence. Victoria knelt, her smile bright but failing to reach her eyes. "Leo, I brought a little something for you," she said, handing him an enormous box. Inside was a state-of-the-art robot, a technological toy that responded to voice commands and promised to be a child's best friend. Leo thanked her with the politeness taught by Mrs. Davison, but his fingers barely touched the toy's cold metal. He placed it on the floor, where the robot remained, lifeless, just another piece in the vast collection of his loneliness. While Arthur and Victoria strolled through the garden, discussing the profitability of their respective portfolios, Helena received her first task: to clean Leo's playroom. Mrs. Davison escorted her, her instructions as sharp as shards of glass. "The boy does not like to be disturbed. You go in, you clean, and you get out. Do not touch anything personal. You are here to be invisible." When the housekeeper left, Helena paused at the doorway. The room didn't feel like a place of joy, but a warehouse of unclaimed wealth. Expensive toys filled the shelves, many still in their original boxes. It was a shrine to a father's trial and error, proof that money could buy everything except happiness. Helena began to clean with the quiet efficiency that was her trademark. Her gaze didn't linger on the expensive objects, but on the small details. In a corner of the mahogany desk, between digital pens and tablets, she saw a drawing made with a worn-down crayon. It was a little bird with one wing noticeably smaller than the other, trying to balance on a branch. That simple image, filled with a childlike vulnerability, touched her heart in a way that all the opulence of the mansion could not. She felt a pang of sadness for this boy who had everything, and at the same time seemed to have nothing. When Leo returned to his room, he expected to find it empty as always. He was surprised to see Helena finishing dusting a shelf. He stopped, hesitant, expecting her to ignore him as all the other staff members did. But Helena turned, and instead of the usual indifference, she offered him a soft, genuine smile, a small gesture that asked for nothing in return. She didn't try to make small talk or offer forced praise. She simply finished her work, gathered her supplies, and headed for the door. Before leaving, her eyes fell on the drawing on the desk. "He's a very brave little bird," she said softly, almost a whisper, and then she was gone, leaving silence behind her, but a different, less heavy silence. From his office, Arthur watched the brief interaction on camera. He dismissed it as irrelevant, focusing on the failure of the interaction with Victoria. The synergy wasn't there. He would need to analyze the data and adjust his approach for the next candidate. Later that night, long after the glow of business had faded from Arthur's screens, Leo was in his room. Victoria's robot remained untouched. The boy picked up the drawing of the broken-winged bird, the one Helena had noticed. He walked to the window, looking out into the darkness of the garden, and pressed the paper against the cold glass. A single, silent, salty tear rolled down his cheek. Carrying the weight of a story no one in the house yet knew. The next candidate, an heiress to a jewelry dynasty named Charlotte Dubois, was the antithesis of Victoria. Where Victoria was corporate and sharp, Charlotte was soft and artistic. Her fortune came not from volatile stocks, but from generations of gold and precious stones, and she carried this heritage with an ethereal elegance. She arrived in a linen dress that whispered, rather than shouted, its wealth. Her gift for Leo didn't come in a flashy box. It was a set of oil paints and a small canvas on a wooden easel. "Art helps us say the things we don't have words for," she told Leo in a melodious voice. Arthur watched, intrigued. This was a different approach, less focused on the profit of a union and more on emotional connection. Perhaps this was what was missing. Leo, as always, was polite. He touched the soft bristles of the brushes, smelled the strong scent of the paints, and thanked Charlotte with a nod. But during lunch, as the adults discussed the beauty of a famous painting worth millions, the easel remained in the corner of the room, an invitation to a dialogue Leo wasn't ready to have. The blank canvas remained white, a mirror of the distance that still separated him from the world. Meanwhile, on the upper floors, Helena was cleaning Arthur's suite. The task required extra care, as Mrs. Davison had warned her about the importance of every object in this sanctuary of business and memories. It was there that Helena began to perceive the true map of the house. It wasn't a map of rooms and corridors, but of contained emotions. There was the rigidity of the office, the formality of the reception rooms, and then the painful stillness of Leo's room. While organizing Arthur's personal library, she noticed a detail that made her pause. Leo often passed through this hallway on his way to his room, and when he thought no one was around, he would hum. It was always the same tune, a simple lullaby, almost a murmur, fragile and repetitive. It wasn't a song from a cartoon or a children's show. It felt older, more personal. Mrs. Davison, passing through the hall with her clipboard in hand, saw Helena pause for a moment longer than necessary. "The work won't do itself," the housekeeper said with veiled acidity. "And remember, your job is to clean, not to observe." Helena simply nodded, tucking the melody away in her memory like a precious secret. That night, Arthur's frustration grew. 2 candidates, 2 failures. He sat in his office, the bluish light of the monitors reflecting on his tired face. The financial market was easier to predict than his own son. In an attempt to find a pattern, a clue, he began reviewing the security camera footage from the day. He saw Charlotte trying, unsuccessfully, to engage Leo in a conversation about colors. He saw his son's distant politeness. He saw the blank canvas. Then he skipped to the footage of the hallways, looking for anything out of the ordinary. He saw the new cleaner, Helena, working silently. He saw the moment Mrs. Davison reprimanded her. He frowned. There was something in Helena's posture, a calmness that contrasted with the tension pervading the rest of the house. He watched her more closely. There was nothing wrong with her actions, but there was an attentiveness in her gaze he didn't see in the other staff. He dismissed the thought, classifying it as irrelevant to his primary objective. His problem wasn't the cleaning staff, but the complex equation of a young boy's heart. Little did he know that the solution was unfolding right before his eyes. In the details that he geeked in his search for grand answers, was unable to see. The day ended like the others, with Leo in his room, staring out the window, the world outside as distant as the stars. Diana Petrov, the 3rd candidate, burst into the mansion like a gust of wind. The daughter of a tech billionaire, she had the restless energy of someone who had built her own fortune on top of the family inheritance, investing aggressively in cryptocurrency and startups. She didn't wear silk dresses, but designer pants and a leather jacket that cost more than a mid-size car. She ignored the formality of lunch and took Arthur and Leo straight to the garden. "The world doesn't happen inside 4 walls," she declared, opening a metal briefcase. Her gift for Leo was a state-of-the-art drone with a camera capable of streaming real-time images to a digital watch. "With this, you can explore everything, own the sky," she said. her eyes gleaming with the promise of power and control. The drone shot into the air, a silver speck buzzing over the vast Blackwood estate. Leo watched, his face expressionless, as Diana maneuvered the device with skill. To him, the drone wasn't freedom. It was just another loud, lonely object, as distant and unreachable as the sky it flew in. The boy didn't want to own the sky. He just wanted someone to sit with him on the grass. Later, while Diana discussed the future of Bitcoin and the profit potential of new digital assets with Arthur, Helena was in the main kitchen, polishing silverware under Mrs. Davison's watchful eye. The work was repetitive and silent. To fill the void, Helena began to hum softly, almost to herself, the simple melody she had heard Leo murmur in the hallway. It was a gentle sound, a note of warmth in the cold, sterile environment of the kitchen. That's when Leo walked in. Having escaped the business talk in the garden, upon hearing the melody, he stopped short. His eyes, usually clouded with apathy, focused on Helena with surprising intensity. He didn't say a word, but his whole body leaned toward the sound, like a plant seeking sunlight. It was his song, his mother's secret song, and here it was, on a stranger's lips. Mrs. Davison, noticing the scene, shattered the moment with her icy voice. "Helena, Master Leo requires quiet, and your work area today is not here. Return to your duties." The housekeeper shot Helena a look laden with suspicion, interpreting her song not as an innocent act, but as a calculated attempt to get closer to the heir of this immense fortune. Helena quietly apologized and withdrew, feeling the weight of the injustice. Leo watched her go, a shadow of disappointment crossing his face. From his office, Arthur saw only fragments of the scene on his monitors. He was on a crucial video call, finalizing a capital investment that promised an extraordinary return. He saw Diana alone in the garden and Leo wandering into the kitchen. He registered the presence of the cleaner and the housekeeper's intervention, but his mind was occupied with cash flow charts and interest projections. To him, it was just another indication that Diana's approach had also failed. The day was proving to be a loss on his emotional balance sheet. That afternoon, while cleaning the long second-floor hallway, Helena found something out of place. Right in the middle of the polished marble floor, directly in her path, lay a single, perfectly intact chocolate chip cookie. She looked around, but the hall was deserted. Then she remembered an observation she had made the day before. She had noticed Leo always left one cookie untouched on his snack plate. She had asked one of the kitchen staff, who shrugged and said the boy simply didn't like sweets, but Helena had seen, through the window, Leo leave the cookie near the guard dog's house in the garden. Now, that cookie was here for her. It wasn't $1 million gift, but an offering of trust, a shared secret left for the one person in the house who seemed to understand his silent language. The fourth woman, Dr. Eleanor Vance, was not an heiress in the traditional sense. Her capital was intellectual. Hailing from a family of academics who managed vast philanthropic endowments, Eleanor was a renowned child psychologist. She arrived with a leather briefcase instead of a designer handbag and dispensed with the pleasantries. To her, this was a case study. Her approach with Leo was direct and clinical. She didn't bring a toy, but a set of logic puzzles designed to assess cognitive development. "Play is the highest form of research," she told Arthur, quoting a phrase that sounded more like a thesis than an invitation to affection. She sat with Leo at a table, timing his attempts to solve the puzzles, taking notes on a tablet. Arthur, at first, was impressed by the method. It was logical, measurable, almost like analyzing a company's assets. But as he watched his son, he saw something dim in Leo's eyes with each of Eleanor's new instructions. The boy wasn't playing. He was being tested. The room, which should have been a space for connection, had transformed into a clinic, and the warmth of Arthur's hope began to dissipate, replaced by a desolate chill. Eleanor's wealth of knowledge couldn't fill the void in the boy's heart. As the assessment continued in the living room, Mrs. Davison intensified her surveillance of Helena. The housekeeper assigned her the most thankless task: cleaning Leo's vast collection of tin soldiers, an heirloom from the boy's grandfather that he rarely touched. Mrs. Davison watched her from a distance, convinced the cleaner was plotting something to increase her influence and, perhaps, secure a piece of the future inheritance. Helena began the work with her usual care. It was then she noticed, near where she was cleaning, one of the soldiers lying on the rug, its arm broken. It didn't look like an accidental fall. It had been placed there. Like the cookie in the hallway, it was another message, a test of a different kind than Eleanor's. It was a request for repair, an offer of trust in a broken world. With the delicacy of someone handling something sacred, Helena picked up the small metal figure. Her fingers traced the worn paint, the soldier's impassive face. She felt the weight of that small object, not in ounces, but in meaning. It was a piece of Leo's world, and he had entrusted it to her. Mrs. Davison saw the gesture. In her mind, the scene transformed into proof of a transgression. She didn't see care. She saw an employee touching personal property, violating the mansion's most sacred protocol. With grim satisfaction, she marched to Arthur's office, interrupting his dispirited observation of the psychology session. "Mr. Blackwood, forgive the interruption," she said, her voice heavy with calculated urgency. "But as I suspected, the new cleaner is overstepping her bounds. She is meddling with Master Leo's personal belongings. I saw her pick up one of the tin soldiers from the collection. It is inappropriate and manipulative behavior." The housekeeper's warning landed in Arthur's already frustrated mind like a spark on dry tinder. Manipulation. It was a word he understood well in the business world. People who approach with smiles to get something. He thanked Mrs. Davison, and as soon as she left, he accessed the security system, rewinding the footage from the playroom. He saw Helena find the soldier. He saw the careful way she held it. Later, he found her on another camera in the service hallway. She had taken a tiny bottle of glue from her cleaning kit, and Dee, with a surgeon's precision, was mending the soldier's arm. Arthur zoomed in on the image, focusing on Helena's face. There was no malice there, no ambition. There was only an expression of tender concentration, a genuine care for a broken object. Arthur's business logic screamed that this was a strategy, an investment of kindness with the expectation of a large future return. But his eyes saw something else, something his vast business dictionary couldn't define, and a painful, confusing suspicion began to take root in his heart. The fifth and final candidate was Isabella Laurent, and her name alone was a stab to Arthur's heart. It was a cruel coincidence, an echo of the past that he didn't know whether to take as a good omen or a warning. Heiress to a shipping empire, her net worth was nearly as vast as his own. She was the candidate who, on paper, surpassed all others. Beautiful, cultured, with a smile that seemed designed for the covers of financial magazines. Arthur found himself, for the first time, wanting it to work, wishing for the logic of his plan to finally prove correct. Isabella, aware of her position, acted with the precision of a CEO closing a deal. Her gift for Leo was the most extravagant of all. A miniature pony, complete with a leather saddle bearing the boy's initials embossed in gold. The animal was brought to the garden by two handlers, a gesture of opulence that turned the lawn into a stage. "Every child needs a loyal friend," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Leo approached, his wide eyes fixed on the animal. He touched the pony's soft muzzle, a hesitant gesture. But the sheer grandeur of the gift intimidated him. It was another asset to be managed rather than a friend to be loved. He took a step back, seeking the safety of the house's shadow, leaving the pony to graze alone in the center of the garden. an expensive and lonely symbol of adult misunderstanding. While this scene unfolded in the garden, Helena was in the greenhouse, a small glass structure at the back of the property, tending to the late Mrs. Blackwood's orchids. It was a task Mrs. Davison had given her as punishment for her familiarity, but for Helena it was a refuge. The air was warm and humid, and the scent of the flowers was a balm. While watering the plants, she found the mended tin soldier, carefully placed in an empty pot. Beside it was a small nutshell. She smiled. It was another message, a silent thank you. During her lunch break, sitting on a hidden bench behind the greenhouse, she took the nutshell and, with a small pocket knife she always carried for minor repairs, began to carve. Her fingers, accustomed to hard work, moved with surprising agility. In less than half an hour, the nutshell had transformed into a tiny sailboat with a mast made from a toothpick and a sail from a dried leaf. It was worth nothing in dollars or euros. It would generate no interest or dividends. But it was made of time, care, and affection, the only currency that mattered in Leo's silent kingdom. From his office, Arthur watched everything on split screens. On one, the pony grazed melancholically. On another, Isabella tried in vain to maintain a conversation with Leo, who only responded in monosyllables. Arthur's frustration was palpable. His selection process, as carefully planned as a high-yield stock investment, had resulted in a total loss. On an impulse, he switched one of the cameras to the service area, looking for Helena. He found her leaving the greenhouse. He watched her walk to the back kitchen door and leave the tiny nutshell boat on the windowsill, the same place Leo sometimes left the cookie for the guard dog. It was a quick, discreet, almost invisible gesture. Minutes later, Arthur saw Leo approach the window. The boy saw the little boat. He picked it up with a reverent gentleness, his small fingers tracing the curves of the nutshell, and then something happened that made Arthur's heart stop. A smile, not a polite, forced smile, but a genuine, radiant smile that lit up his face like the morning sun. He ran inside to his room and came back with a basin of water. He sat on the grass and set the boat afloat, blowing gently to move the tiny leaf sail. For the first time in 2 years, Leo was playing. Arthur, the billionaire, the master of business, felt the floor of his logic crumble beneath him. That tiny nutshell, an object of no monetary value, had just humbled a thoroughbred pony, a state-of-the-art robot, and a high-tech drone. His suspicion of Helena didn't turn to admiration. It exploded into a crisis of understanding. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. He only knew that the foundation of his empire of certainties had just been shaken by a boat made from trash. That night marked a crack in Arthur Blackwood's armor. Leo's smile, provoked by a simple nutshell boat, haunted him. He sat in his office, the screens displaying the constant flow of his business, the growth of his assets, the dividends from his stocks. For the first time in his life, the numbers seemed empty, meaningless. His fortune, which could move mountains in the financial world, had failed to coax a single genuine smile from his son. The selection process, his grand investment in his family's emotional future, had been a resounding failure. He felt like the captain of an immense ship, capable of navigating any economic storm, but completely lost on the small map of a child's heart. The logic that had made him a billionaire was crumbling before the simplicity of a nutshell. He was reassessing his strategies, considering new approaches, when a sharp, terrified sound cut through the silence of the mansion. It was a scream. Leo's scream. A chill shot down Arthur's spine, a panic that no stock market crash had ever caused him. He ran to his son's room, arriving at the same time as the night nurse, and, moments later, Mrs. Davison, who had been awakened by the noise. Leo was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror, trembling uncontrollably. He was screaming about shadows, about a monster chasing him in the dark. The nurse tried to hug him, but he pushed her away. Mrs. Davison, With her practical approach, turned on all the lights and opened the closet to show that nothing was there. "It was just a bad dream, Master Leo. See, everything is safe," she said, her voice firm but devoid of any warmth. Her logical words didn't reach the boy's irrational terror. Arthur approached, his heart aching with helplessness. "Son, it's me, Dad. I'm here. What do you want? Do you want a new toy? I can buy you anything." But Leo didn't hear him. He was trapped in his nightmare, and not all of his father's net worth could build a bridge to get him out. Desperate, Arthur was about to reach for the phone to call a doctor, convinced something was terribly wrong. That's when a hesitant figure appeared in the doorway. It was Helena, finishing her late cleaning of the hallway. She held a cloth in her hand, her eyes filled with genuine concern. She was violating every rule by approaching like this, and Mrs. Davison's withering glare made that clear. May I try?" Helena asked in a low voice, addressing Arthur. The housekeeper opened her mouth to reprimand her, to expel her from this sacred space of family crisis. But Arthur, in his desperation, saw something in Helena's eyes that he hadn't seen in anyone else's. Not pity, not duty, but a deep, calm empathy. With nothing left to lose, he just nodded. Helena entered the room. She didn't turn on more lights, offer false reassurances, or try to touch him. She simply sat on the floor beside the bed, at a respectful distance, and waited for the boy's storm of panic to subside enough for him to notice her presence. Then, in her soft voice, she began to speak. Not about monsters that don't exist, but about a little bird who was afraid to fly in the dark. She didn't tell a story of princes and dragons, but the story she had imagined from the drawing she had seen days before. "There was a little bird with a wing that was a bit different," she began, "and at night the shadows looked like giant branches trying to catch him." Leo's screams turned to sobs, the sobs to shaky breaths. He stopped looking at the shadows and fixed his gaze on Helena, his eyes still full of tears, but now also a curiosity that overcame the fear. He just listened until his heavy head drooped onto the pillow, and finally he fell asleep. In the silence that followed, Arthur Blackwood looked from the serene figure of Helena to the peaceful face of his son, and the world as he knew it turned upside down. The next morning dawned on a transformed mansion. The hierarchy, once rigid as steel, had been subtly shaken. At breakfast, Arthur barely touched his food. Sleep had escaped him, his mind replaying the scene from the night before. The image of Helena, sitting on the floor of a room worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, calming his son with a story about a broken bird, was more powerful than any profit and loss report he had ever read. In his office, he didn't turn on the stock market monitors. Instead, he pulled up the security footage from Leo's room, not with the suspicion of an employer, but with the humility of a father who had been a spectator in his own life. He watched it again and again. He saw the failure of his own methods, the ineffectiveness of Mrs. Davison, the pure, terrifying impotence of his money. And then he saw Helena's calm. Her voice, inaudible on the recording, was translated by the transformation on Leo's face. Terror giving way to attention, attention to calm, calm to sleep. Arthur felt a wave of something he barely recognized, gratitude, and with it, an even deeper confusion. In his business world, every act had a motive. Every investment sought a return. What was the expected ROI on Helena's kindness? He couldn't calculate it, and that both frightened and fascinated him. For Mrs. Davison, gratitude was not an option. Helena's intervention had been a direct affront to her authority, a breach of protocol she could not tolerate. In her worldview, the cleaner hadn't calmed a child. She had executed a brilliant maneuver to infiltrate the family's inner circle. The housekeeper felt her power, carefully built over years of loyal service, slipping through her fingers. She saw Helena not as a threat to Leo's well-being, but as a dangerous competitor in the struggle for control of the house and the boss's trust. She decided she had to act, not openly, which would make her seem petty, but subtly, undermining Helena's position with small, constant pieces of evidence of her incompetence and manipulative nature. Her first move was to forbid Helena from cleaning any area near Leo's quarters, assigning her to polish the vast collection of the late grandfather's equestrian trophies in the East Wing, as far away from the boy as possible. Leo, however, had his own plans. That afternoon, feeling Helena's absence, he sought her out. He found her in the silent trophy room, a soft cloth in her hands. Moving among the silver and gold statues, he said nothing. He just walked in and sat on a nearby step, holding his little nutshell boat. Helena saw him and smiled, continuing her work in a comfortable silence. After a few minutes, Leo asked in a low voice, "The little bird, did he learn to fly in the dark?" Helena stopped polishing a gleaming trophy. "He's learning," she replied with the same softness. "He discovered that if he hums his favorite song very quietly, the shadows get scared and go away." Leo pondered this, his eyes serious. At that moment, Arthur, who was monitoring his son's movements through the house with a newfound attention, watched the scene on his monitor. He saw the ease between them, a connection that he, with all his assets and power, had never managed to forge. Admiration began to win out over suspicion. Later that day, Mrs. Davison approached Arthur with a grave expression. In her hand, she held a small gold pocket watch, a family heirloom. "Mr. Blackwood, this was in the service hallway's trash bin, the same bin Helena uses to dispose of her cleaning supplies. I found it by pure chance. I'm not accusing anyone, of course, but it is a most unfortunate coincidence. The blow was perfectly calculated." Arthur looked at the watch, then at the housekeeper's earnest face, and felt the old chill of suspicion return, stronger and more confusing than ever. The gold watch felt like it weighed a ton in Arthur's hand. It was an object from his world, valuable, tangible, an asset. Mrs. Davison's veiled accusation was a piece of information, data to be processed. His business instincts, honed by years of negotiations where mistrust was a survival tool, told him to be cautious. An employee who pockets small items might one day aim for a larger piece of the treasure. Yet, the image of Helena telling a story to his terrified son was a different kind of data, one that didn't fit on any risk assessment spreadsheet. He spent the rest of the day in a state of paralyzing internal conflict. He watched his stock prices rise and fall, the cash flow of his businesses moving millions. But his mind was stuck in that service hallway, trying to reconcile the image of a thief with that of a savior. He decided to do what he always did. When faced with an anomaly in his investments, he would investigate, discreetly, without alerting either party. He would not confront Helena. He would observe her. Mrs. Davison, feeling she had successfully planted the seed of doubt, tightened her grip. Helena was assigned to increasingly isolated tasks, cleaning the basement, organizing the wine cellar, polishing the silver stored in a rarely opened vault. They were jobs that kept her away from Leo and under constant surveillance. Helena felt the change in the atmosphere. The housekeeper's glances were colder, the orders more curt. She didn't understand the reason for the hostility, but she felt its suffocating effect. The joy she had felt in connecting with Leo was being replaced by a constant anxiety. The warmth of the house, which she had begun to feel behind its opulent facade, was turning into a biting cold. The mansion, with all its wealth, was starting to feel like a prison, not just for the boy, but for her as well. Her only solace was the brief moment when, taking out the trash, she would see Leo in his bedroom window. He wouldn't wave, wouldn't smile, but would just watch her, holding the nutshell boat. It was a silent communion that gave her the strength to carry on. While reviewing the financials of one of his funds, Arthur's mind drifted. He remembered Isabella, his late wife. She had come from a family of considerable wealth, but possessed a simplicity that he, at the time, had considered a quaint charm rather than an essential virtue. She found joy in things that had no price tag: the smell of earth after rain, the taste of homemade bread, the lullaby she would hum to Leo, the same lullaby Helena hummed. The realization hit him with a physical force. Was it possible that he, in his search for a replacement with an impeccable financial pedigree, had been overlooking the very qualities he had loved most in his first wife? The search for a new mother for Leo was becoming, with each passing day, a painful re-evaluation of his own life, his choices, his understanding of what truly constituted a man's legacy. Late that night, when the house was silent, Arthur sat before his monitors. He wasn't looking at the Tokyo Stock Exchange or the price of Bitcoin. He was reviewing hours of security footage, searching for the truth. He found the footage of the service hallway at the moment the gold watch would have been discarded. The image wasn't clear, partially obstructed by a cleaning cart. He saw Helena pass by, empty her small trash pail, and leave. Minutes later, he saw Mrs. Davison enter the hallway. She didn't just walk past. She stopped beside the trash bin, just out of the camera's blind spot. Her body blocked the view of what she was doing. She stood there for just 3 seconds before continuing on her way. 3 seconds, just long enough. Arthur's heart began to beat faster. He didn't have definitive proof, but he had something far more powerful: reasonable doubt. The suspicion began to shift, like the tectonic plates of his world, moving away from Helena and slowly, inexorably, toward the woman he trusted to run his home. The discovery of Mrs. Davison's 3 seconds on the video brought Arthur no relief, only a new layer of complexity. He had built his multi-billion-dollar empire on facts, on hard data. A shadow on a recording was not proof, it was a hypothesis, and to accuse Mrs. Davison, a long-serving and impeccably efficient employee, based on a suspicion, was a risk his calculating nature was loath to take. However, the possibility that she had framed Helena disgusted him. It was a betrayal not just of him, but of the principles of fairness that he liked to believe guided his life, even in the cutthroat world of business. He decided to continue his observation, but with a new focus. He was no longer looking for flaws in Helena, but for inconsistencies in the housekeeper's behavior. He became a silent hunter in his own home, analyzing every report, every gesture, every word from Mrs. Davison. With the same scrutiny he applied to a high-risk investment contract. He realized how deeply the housekeeper controlled the flow of information in the mansion, deciding what he saw and what remained hidden in the service areas. For Leo, Helena's absence was a palpable reality. The days returned to the gray color of loneliness. Food had less taste. The toys seemed more lifeless. He missed her soft humming in the hallway, the way she seemed to understand his silences. He tried asking Mrs. Davison about her, but the housekeeper was evasive. "Miss Helena is very busy with her new duties. Master Leo has everything he needs right here," she replied, offering him a new tablet, as if an electronic device could replace a human connection. Leo's frustration grew, transforming into a quiet rebellion. He began leaving small gifts for Helena in places where he knew she, and only she, would find them. A seashell he found in the garden appeared at the bottom of a cleaning bucket. A bluebird's feather was left on the threshold of the wine cellar door. They were small acts of loyalty, beacons of hope in an attempt to keep their fragile alliance alive. Helena found each of these treasures and kept them in her pocket, small anchors that kept her from feeling completely adrift in this tide of hostility. The tension in the house was almost palpable, an undeclared liability on the family's balance sheet. Arthur, increasingly detached from his business, spent hours in his office, not working, but observing the human interactions in his home like an anthropologist studying an unknown tribe. It was during one of these surveillance sessions that he found something. He was reviewing the audio from one of the kitchen cameras, adjusting the levels to try and hear a distant conversation. By chance, he isolated a clip where Mrs. Davison was speaking on the phone to her sister. The conversation was about trivialities, until the housekeeper said something that made Arthur's blood run cold. "Don't you worry," Mrs. Davison said in a low voice. "The boss is a businessman. He'll always choose the safest asset. This cleaner, she's a high-risk stock. Her account will be closed soon." The financial metaphor, the very language he himself used, sounded obscene coming from her. The coldness with which she described firing Helena as closing an account revealed the true nature of her loyalty. It wasn't to the family, but to order, to the status quo, to the system that placed her in a position of power. There was no more doubt. Mrs. Davison wasn't protecting his home, she was protecting her own little fiefdom. And Helena wasn't a threat to his fortune, but to her authority. The proof was no longer in a shadowy image, but in clear, calculated words. The scales of justice, in Arthur's mind, finally tipped, and he knew a decision had to be made. The revelation of Mrs. Davison's phone call was the catalyst Arthur needed. The ambiguity dissipated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He felt a slow, deep anger simmering inside him, not just for the slander against Helena, but for the way the housekeeper had turned his home into a battlefield for petty power. He realized that Mrs. Davison's rigidity, which he had always seen as professionalism, was actually a form of control, a system designed to isolate Leo and himself in a bubble of sterile formality. She wasn't running a home, she was managing an asset, and any human, unpredictable, and warm element like Helena was seen as a volatility to be eliminated from the portfolio. Arthur decided that the grand finale he had planned to choose a new mother for Leo would now serve an entirely different purpose. It would no longer be an event to announce his choice from among the 5 candidates, but a stage to unmask the futility of his own methods and reveal the truth that had blossomed in the shadow of his wealth. He began preparations for the event, a formal dinner at the mansion. The 5 candidates were invited again, under the pretext that he would be announcing his final decision. The city's elite were also summoned. Arthur wanted witnesses. He wanted the lesson he was about to learn to be public, a form of penance for his arrogance. Mrs. Davison oversaw the preparations with renewed zeal, believing the event would solidify her status and result in the choice of one of the appropriate ladies, restoring the natural order of things. She issued strict orders to the staff, relegating Helena to the kitchen with the express instruction to remain invisible for the entire evening. Helena accepted the orders without question. A part of her was relieved to be away from the gazes of high society. Another part felt a pang of sadness. Her temporary contract was ending, and she knew that after this night, she would likely never see Leo again. She clung to the little treasures he had left for her, the seashell, the feather, the mended soldier, as if they were the most precious jewels in the world. On the eve of the grand event, Leo fell ill. It wasn't serious, just a low-grade fever and a malaise that left him listless and tearful. The night nurse couldn't console him, and the medicine seemed to have no effect. Arthur went to his room and found his son curled up under the covers, his face flushed with fever. Leo refused to eat, drink, or speak. He only whispered one word, over and over, "Helena." Arthur's heart clenched. He knew what he had to do. He went down to the service area, a territory he rarely visited. He found Helena on her knees, scrubbing the pantry floor. "Helena," he said, his voice sounding strange in that environment. "Leo is asking for you. He's sick. Could you go see him?" Helena's eyes lifted, surprised and filled with concern. She didn't hesitate. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him through the silent corridors. Upon entering Leo's room, she didn't rush to the bed. She sat in the same chair from the night of the nightmare and, in a low voice, began to tell the story of the little bird. This time, she added a new chapter. "The little bird caught a cold because he tried to fly in a storm," she whispered. "But a friend came and brought him a tiny sunflower seed, the warmest one of all. And the warmth of the seed helped him get better." Leo, who had refused to take anything, opened his mouth when Helena offered him a spoonful of warm broth, as if it were the magic seed from the story. Arthur watched from the doorway, no longer a billionaire, but a man witnessing a silent miracle. The attraction he had begun to feel, born of admiration and respect, started to deepen, transforming into something warmer, more personal, and infinitely more terrifying. The night of the event arrived, and the Blackwood mansion glittered with a cold, impersonal splendor. Crystal chandeliers poured light onto polished marble floors, and exotic floral arrangements, ordered by Mrs. Davison, perfumed the air with an expensive, lifeless fragrance. The guests, the cream of society, mingled in the grand hall, their hushed whispers and laughter echoing against the high ceiling. The 5 candidates were present, each a study in elegance and expectation. Victoria, Charlotte, Diana, Eleanor, and Isabella looked like princesses in a corporate fairy tale. Their silk gowns and sparkling jewels, an investment in a night that promised a lifetime return. They conversed with Arthur, smiling and offering their opinions on art, business, and philanthropy. Arthur, for his part, played his role with an outward calm that belied the storm in his chest. He greeted guests, accepted compliments on his home and his son, but his eyes, every so often, would drift to the massive oak door that separated the hall from the service area. Behind that door, the atmosphere was different. Mrs. Davison commanded the kitchen staff with the precision of a general, ensuring every canapé was perfect, every champagne flute was full. Helena worked in silence, washing the delicate porcelain dishes, her hands submerged in warm water. She could hear the classical music and the hum of conversation from the other side, a world as distant from hers as the moon. The sound of the party was a painful reminder that her time here was ending. She thought of Leo, who, though better from his fever, had remained in his room, deemed by Mrs. Davison as too unwell for social events. Helena's heart ached at the thought of leaving without saying goodbye. Every plate she cleaned felt like a farewell to a chapter of her life that, though brief and complicated, had touched her soul in an unexpected way. Finally, the moment came. Arthur stepped onto a small dais, and the hall fell silent. The 5 women subtly positioned themselves, their smiles tight with anticipation. Mrs. Davison, watching through a crack in the service door, felt a shiver of triumph. Order would be restored. "I thank you all for coming tonight," Arthur began, his voice firm and clear, resonating through the hall. "And I've invited you here to help me celebrate an important decision about my family's future." He paused, letting the tension build. "For the past few months, I've been searching for a companion, and more importantly, a mother for my son, Leo. I have met 5 wonderful, intelligent, and successful women, and I'm grateful for the time they have dedicated to us." The women smiled modestly. "However," Arthur continued, "as this selection process has taught me something that all my capital, all my business expertise never could. I've learned that a person's value is not found in their net worth, but in the depth of their heart." The candidates' smiles faltered. In the kitchen, Helena stopped working, her hand holding a wineglass in mid-air. She could hear Arthur's voice clearly. Then, to everyone's shock, Arthur knelt in the middle of the hall. He knelt, not before one of the 5 women, but before the empty space. And he called out, "Leo, son, can you come here, please?" A side door to the hall opened, and little Leo, dressed in his best pajamas, walked in, his serious eyes fixed on his father. The tension in the hall was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The moment of greatest tension and emotional resolution in that house had finally arrived. The shocked murmur that rippled through the hall was like the sound of a breaking wave. Leo walked slowly to his father, his small, bare feet cold on the marble floor. He didn't look at the guests or at the 5 women watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. His eyes were only on Arthur. Arthur took his son's small hands. "My son," he said, his voice thick with emotion but loud enough for all to hear. "All of these ladies are wonderful. But I want to know, who would you want to stay with us? Who makes your heart feel safe?" The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes were fixed on the small figure in pajamas in the center of this universe of wealth and power. Leo looked at the 5 women. He saw the forced smiles, the glittering jewels, the perfect gowns. Then his eyes swept the hall, past the curious faces of the guests, searching for something or someone who wasn't there. His gaze found the kitchen door, standing ajar, and he saw her. Helena stood there, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale with shock and fear, her eyes filled with tears. In an instant, a child's decision, pure and unwavering, changed everything. He ran. He ran past the silk gowns and designer heels, ignoring the gasps of astonishment. He didn't run to the most expensive toy, nor to the promise of a glittering future. He ran toward warmth, toward safety, toward the only safe harbor he had known in recent times. Leo threw himself into the arms of the cleaner, who received him with a sob of surprise and affection, wrapping him in an embrace that was both protective and desperate. "Her," Leo said, his voice loud and clear, echoing through the stunned silence. "I choose Helena. She knows the story of the little bird." The scene left everyone in complete shock. The 5 candidates stood frozen, a mixture of embarrassment and indignation on their perfect faces. Mrs. Davison at the kitchen door was as white as a ghost, her mouth agape in horror at the catastrophic breach of every protocol she held dear. And Arthur, still on his knees in the middle of the hall, was no longer a billionaire controlling his empire. He was just a man, a father who broke down in tears of relief and remorse, realizing that the love he had been searching for in luxury catalogs and on balance sheets had been scrubbing the floors of his house all along. He stood up, walked through the petrified crowd, and stopped before Helena and Leo. With a gentleness that surprised everyone, including himself, he placed a hand on Helena's shoulder. "Mrs. Davison," he said, his voice calm but with a thread of steel, "please pack your things. Your services are no longer required." He then turned to the guests. "The party is over. Thank you for coming." There were no protests. People began to file out in silence, leaving behind the most talked-about scandal of the year. The 5 candidates left hastily. Their dreams of a profitable merger turned to dust. In minutes, the hall was empty, save for the 3 of them. Arthur looked at Helena, whose face was streaked with tears. "Helena, He couldn't find the words, so he did the only thing his heart told him to do. He apologized. "Forgive me for my suspicion, for my blindness." He looked at his son, still clinging to her. "Leo made his choice, and I'd like to make mine. Please, stay, not as an employee, stay as part of us." The attraction that had grown between them, born of mutual admiration and respect, finally bloomed in that moment of raw vulnerability and truth. Together, the 3 of them, in the middle of the lavish and now empty hall, found what fortune could never buy: the beginning of a real family. The next morning in the Blackwood mansion was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy silence of loneliness, but the serene stillness of a new beginning. Mrs. Davison and a few other staff members who shared her rigid, dehumanizing view of the household departed before dawn, leaving behind a vacuum that was quickly filled by an atmosphere of warmth and relief. Arthur, for the first time in years, did not go to his office. Instead, He made breakfast in the main kitchen, clumsily trying to operate the espresso machine. Dusting the marble countertop with coffee grounds, Helena found him there, still in the clothes from the night before, her eyes a little swollen, but a shy smile on her lips. I don't think this was in your job description," she teased, grabbing a cloth to wipe up the mess. "I'm adding new skills to my portfolio," Arthur replied, his smile reaching his eyes for the first time in a long while. Breakfast was simple, shared at the large kitchen table, not in the formal dining room. Leo sat between them, chattering about the little bird from his story, which had finally learned to fly. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene with a golden promise. In the weeks that followed, the mansion transformed. Rigid protocols were replaced by laughter that echoed through the halls. The playroom, once a mausoleum of expensive gifts, became a space for creation, where nutshell boats and colorful bird drawings were more prized than any electronic device. Arthur began to delegate more of his business, discovering that the true profit in his life wasn't on the stock market charts, but in the moments he spent with his son and the woman who had taught him how to see. He and Helena grew closer with a cautious delicacy. Their late-night conversations, after Leo was asleep, were about their dreams, their fears, their histories. He learned of her simple childhood, the loss of her parents, the resilience she carried with a quiet grace. She learned of his pain, the deep love he held for his late wife, and the fear of failing as a father that had driven him to treat life like a business. They didn't rush. Their love was built on the solid foundation of friendship, respect, and mutual admiration, a long-term holding with the promise of infinite returns. One day, months later, Arthur took Helena and Leo to a small lake on the vast property. He had spent the previous week working on something in secret. When they reached the shore, Leo saw a gift. It was not a pony or a drone. It was a wooden boat, large enough for the three of them, that Arthur had built with his own hands, modeled exactly after Helena's tiny nutshell boat. Leo's eyes filled with pure joy as they floated under the blue sky, with Leo at the makeshift helm and Helena laughing beside him. Arthur felt a peace that all his assets in dollars, gold, and Bitcoin could never provide. He realized his true treasure wasn't stored in vaults or invested in stocks. It was right there, in that boat, between the two people who had filled the void of his silent palace. The empire he had built was no longer a monument to his solitude, but the home of a family that, against all odds, had found its fortune in the simplest, most precious details of life. And at the center of it all was a powerful lesson. The greatest investment a man can make is not in capital or assets, but in the simple, priceless act of seeing another's heart.